Oh my God, it happened again. Sometimes that's all we can say when we hear the news. Oh my God, no. You can't watch the news or scan the headlines on your computer these days without seeing the stories. Another terrorist. A man falls to his death in a sinkhole that opened right beneath his bed as he slept. Someone dies in a snowmobile accident. A student at some college shoots another student. And those are just the most sensational of any number of tragic and painful events that occur daily, that trouble our hearts and raise questions in our minds. It's shocking when it's someone we don't know in some other part of the country or part of the world. But when the news hits closer to home, as it just has, it leaves us speechless. We hear echoes of those events in our gospel reading today. Some people are killed to terrorize an entire nation, and some others are crushed by a falling tower. It sounds too familiar. In our gospel, some people approach Jesus and ask his opinion about those two incidents and raise the question, why? One apparently took place at the temple in Jerusalem, when Pilate ordered some Galileans killed while they were in the act of making animal sacrifices to God. The blood of those devout worshipers became mingled with the blood of the animals. The other incident had happened not long before that. The Tower of Siloam, which was part of the fortification of Jerusalem, had collapsed, killing 18 people. It was a construction accident. Now the people approached Jesus and asked, why do those kinds of things happen? Did they happen because the people involved were so wicked that the tragedies were God's judgment upon them? Now let's not be too hard on them for asking that question. That was a pretty common viewpoint among Jews at that time. And honestly, many Christians believe it to this day. That physical suffering, whether the result of illness or tragedy or disaster, was a direct consequence of sin and a clear sign of divine judgment. Have you ever heard or said they had it coming? Or heard those people deserve to be poor because they're lazy? So in some ways, we still operate with the same way of thinking. But Jesus rejects that idea completely. Were those killed by Pilate or those crushed by the tower worse sinners than all the others who survived? Do you think they were worse offenders than all the others living in Jerusalem? And Jesus answers the question directly, which you know is unusual for Jesus. No, I tell you. Everyone needs to repent. Even pious Jews living in the holy city or Lutherans living in Minnesota. Everyone needs to repent. And the need is urgent. Well, today, instead of thinking tragedies are punishment for the victims, many folks think of tragedies as trials for survivors. They appeal to our second reading today and say, I know that God doesn't give us more than we can handle, but right now I feel like I've had more than I can take. Have you ever heard that one? Well, let me answer that directly. God does not cause tragedies or disasters. Lamentations 3 says, for God does not willingly afflict or grieve anyone. That is not the God we know, the God of love and mercy, the God whose ways are revealed in the Bible, whose nature is supremely and perfectly revealed in the life and death of Jesus. A loving God does not cause his children pain. In my own life, I've endured such terrible pain and despair, been driven to the brink of taking my own life. If I were to believe that God had arranged that to teach me something, that God had caused that pain, I couldn't love a God like that. I would hate a God like that. But that's not the God I know. That's not the God of Jesus. James 1 says, no one when tempted should say, I am being tempted by God. For God himself tempts no one. To the contrary, our reading from 1 Corinthians says this: God is faithful, and he will not let you be tested beyond your strength. Is that the same as saying God won't give you more than you can handle? No. It isn't God that does the testing. Satan tests us. Life tests us. And that verse goes on to describe what God does do. It says, with the testing, he will provide the way out so that you may be able to endure it. Now that's the God we know. God doesn't cause tragedy, but he isn't a detached observer of our suffering either. God is immersed in it with us, sharing completely our grief and pain. That's the fundamental meaning of the cross, that God suffers with us. 10 days after the death of his 24-year-old son, Alexander, who had crashed into Boston Harbor while driving in a terrible storm, William Sloane Coffin Jr. wrote these words. This is an extended quote, but it's worth it. He wrote, "Many things can be said when a person dies, but there is at least one thing that should never be said. The night after Alex died, I was sitting in the living room of my sister's house outside Boston when the front door opened and in came a nice-looking middle-aged woman carrying about 18 quiches. When she saw me, she shook her head, then headed for the kitchen, saying over her shoulder, 'I just don't understand the will of God.' Instantly, I was up and in hot pursuit. I knew the anger would do me good. I said, 'Do you think it was the will of God that Alex never fixed that lousy windshield wiper of his? That he was probably driving too fast in such a storm? That he'd probably had a couple too many Frosties? Do you think it's God's will that there are no street lights along that stretch of road and no guardrail separating the road and Boston Harbor?' God doesn't go around with his finger on triggers, his fist around knives, his hands on steering wheels. God is against all unnatural deaths. And Christ spent an inordinate amount of time delivering people from paralysis, insanity, leprosy, and muteness. The one thing that should never be said when someone dies is, 'It is the will of God.' My consolation lies in knowing that it was not the will of God that Alex die. That when the waves closed over the sinking car, God's was the first of all hearts to break." We may wish to start talking theology here and ask the age-old question called theodicy. Why does God let bad things happen to good people? Countless people, volumes have been written trying to answer that theodicy question. But all totaled, the most we can say is we don't know. We don't know why bad things happen to good people. But the best we can say is God's is the first of all hearts to break. And the heart of God we do know. The heart of God is Jesus. The compassionate heart that lifted up the lowly and healed the brokenhearted. That's the God we know. There was a song that was popular a few years back that spoke to this well. People often say there's no depth in Christian radio, but this is a pretty deep song.
Is too little. They let him go. They had no sudden healing. To think that Providence would take a child from his mother while she prays is appalling. Who told us we'd be rescued? What has changed and why should we be saved from nightmares? We're asking hope is born of suffering. If this is only the beginning, can we not wait for 1 hour, watching for our Savior? This is what it means to be held, how it feels when the sacred is torn from your life and you survive. This is what it is to be loved and to know that the promise was when everything fell, we'd be This is what it means to be held.
What do you think was going on in her life when she wrote that song? Dear friends, when we suffer, God's is the first of all hearts to break. God desires that all of his children would be whole in body and spirit, but when we are broken, when the world falls down around us, the promise of the cross is that we'd be held. And that with the testing, he will provide the way out so that you may be able to endure it. Amen.